Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa, and welcome to Threshold of Hope, a program where we bring you the writings of the Church. Before we get to the encyclical, Fides et Ratio, I just want to mention that today is the feast of Our Lady of Lourdes. This commemorates when the Blessed Virgin appeared to Saint Bernadette Soubirous at Lourdes in France. And this was a very important event, both because it helped confirm the papal teaching that had been given a few years before it in the encyclical by which the Pope declared Mary the Immaculate Conception, and at Lourdes she identified herself as the Immaculate Conception. But also, something that's relevant for today's program, at a time in the 1800s when so many were trying simply to focus on rationalism and what reason alone without faith can do, all of a sudden not only is it the Blessed Mother appearing, but we see that a wide variety of many healings and miracles took place, and that undercut some of the rationalistic attitudes of the time, as you can see in a number of the movies about Lourdes. All right, well, we're going through Fides et Ratio, which you can get in a paperback version from EWTN's Religious Catalog. Just go to EWTNreligiouscatalog.com or call them 1-800-854-6316. Of course, you can also download a free electronic copy of Fides et Ratio by going to the document library of EWTN.com, our website. Download it into your computer, print it out, or read it from the computer with us. Now, of course, we'd like you to become involved and participate in our show, either coming to Birmingham, Alabama, and being in our live audience, or you can send us your question by writing to threshold@EWTN.com. All right, we are now on paragraph 46. If you recall, the Pope was talking about how European philosophy began to split faith and reason. And this is something that he wants to deal with in the history of the West. He said that it's not too much to claim that the development of a good part of modern philosophy has moved farther and farther away from Christian revelation. That certainly is the case. And it sets itself very explicitly in opposition to Christian faith or any faith at all. That is pretty dominant for a variety of philosophies that are taught at the universities. Of course, this is aided and abetted by people teaching that you cannot teach religion in the public forum, and so that introduction of the idea of separation of church and state from a Supreme Court decision as written by Justice Hugo Black, a former leader, in fact, of the Ku Klux Klan and a major leader of the Masonic Lodge, who was put on the Supreme Court, wrote a decision about separation of church and state, and that helps augment this throughout the history ever since the 1940s. Now, this process of separating faith and reason reached its apogee, that is, its high point, in the last century, which was the 19th century. Though it really began making its move. As a matter of fact, it started in the 14th century with Marsilius of Padua and William of Ockham, who, in a wonderful book by Dr. Scott Hahn and by Dr. Ben Weicker, both of them been on the programs, called Politicization of the Bible. They describe in detail, it's just fairly detailed, but it's very important to see how already that separation of church, of faith and reason were taking place under the influence of politics, where Emperor Ludwig of Bavaria was trying to keep down the Pope and take more power for himself, as well as keep down his opponents from the Habsburgs. But also, it was about influence from Averroes, who was an Arab commentator on Aristotle. And already that division starts back then and continued especially in the late 1600s through the 1700s, which dubbed itself the Age of Enlightenment, because they were separating faith away from philosophy and science. And they thought that was real enlightenment. And in fact, it was the people of that period who call the time of the church's missionary work with barbarians is what they call the Dark Ages. Now, one of the philosophies that begins to develop is called idealism. By that, the Pope does not mean people who had idealistic morals. That's not it. It's rather a philosophy that came from, again, going back to William of Ockham, who said that there is no such thing as a category. For instance, to say that mammals, all the mammals, warm blood and so on, are one category of life, and that, or animal life, or human life, and none of these categories are real, just names that you put on things. And he taught that everything is individual. Well, he still left mathematics as something that was getting at the objective world. And one of the issues of the 1600s and later was, then how do you get to an objective view of the world? And it's fairly complicated, but just to get a sense that René Descartes tried to use geometry as a way to get an objective perspective on the world. But then other philosophers came up against him, like David Hume, saying, no, he agreed basically with Occam. You can only deal with individual events, and that there is no such thing as real logical causality. There's nothing that causes anything else. And then other philosophers respond to Hume with what's a perspective called idealism. In other words, my ideas of the world are all that you can know. And there are a wide variety of these different idealistic philosophies, but they took on certain important forms. One of them, for instance, with Immanuel Kant and so on, and a variety of others, the basic notion underlying all the idealists, or most of them, I can't even say all of them because they so disagree. The basic notion is, since my mind is what knows the world, then it's my ideas that are reality. Now, this is separating what I know from the real world. See, that was the perspective of Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle, and many others, that you can know the world and its objects, more or less. You can keep learning. But these philosophers in the 17 and 1800s, the idealists, believed, no, you can only know ideas, and that you can use your ideas, and this is where it took off, you can use your ideas to create your own reality, and that my ideas of the world make what the world is. And once you accept that, then you start moving and setting the stage for the possibility of relativism. In other words, if my ideas invent the world or create the world or define the world, or again, there are all sorts of nuances of ways to approach it with the idealists. But so long as my ideas are more important than what is really in the world, the objects, then my ideas are mine, your ideas are yours, and how can we really come to agree about the objective world? You see where that tends to go, and prepares the way for the modern belief in relativism, that there is no objective truth because I can never know the objective world. So this is a very important process to understand for the way a lot of professors and philosophers think. They try to know the objective world through math rather than through the things. And then eventually they gave up that you can know the objective world at all among many. Again, they don't agree among themselves. They don't have a basis for agreement. Hence, they are sort of relativistic. But this is something very important. Now, what the Pope goes on to say here is that idealism sought in various ways to transform faith and its contents, even the mystery of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And they give an example. It was very, very big in the 1700s and 1800s to say, okay, the miracles of Jesus happened, but we will come up with a rationalistic explanation of the miracles to take away the miraculous part and just make them part of reason. So, for instance, there was one German scripture scholar who taught that Jesus really had a medical bag that none of the apostles or the people in the crowds ever saw, and he was just using medicine to heal everybody. Also in that context comes the famous interpretation that Jesus didn't multiply loaves and fish. He just got everybody to share the loaves and fish that they had hidden under the clothes. And this went on with all sorts of other explanations. You eventually get to the point where people like Rudolf Bultmann began to say, well, the people, that is the disciples, wished that Jesus was still alive after the crucifixion. And they had something of a group hypnosis, according to some scholars. They had a group experience of, they felt the presence of Jesus. And that was their rationalistic explanation of Jesus' resurrection. Or you have others who say, no, Jesus didn't really die. He went into a state, they thought he was dead, and then he was resuscitated in the tomb and then walked around, but he died some other time. That was another explanation. So again, none of these explanations agree with each other on this, but they just try to reduce the content of the faith to rational explanations. Now, this is what the Pope then speaks of dialectical structures that could be grasped by reason. In other words, you use science you interact or enter into a dialogue with the Bible text, and then you come up with some sort of an explanation. And this is typical of what happened to many people. I know so many of you write to me, oh, my priest or my teachers or somebody explained the whole Bible away. And again, it's not that the Bible is irrational, but neither is it reduced to the rational. That's what the Pope is talking about. Now, another kind of thinking that was opposed to this, some philosophers reacted against that and said, look, why are you trying to make the Bible sound rationalistic? Forget it. The Bible is just flat out completely wrong, and that there is no God at all. And this took shape among a variety of philosophers, such as Feuerbach, and of course, one of the most successful was Karl Marx. And so that they just had an atheistic humanism. They put it in a philosophy. For instance, Karl Marx was based on the philosophy of Georg Friedrich Hegel. Hegel was an idealist philosopher, and Marx picked up on that and then took it farther and interpreted everything in terms of purely natural realities, and especially he saw all of life through economic history. And for him, the dialectic of history is all about economics, so that economic systems worked against each other and came up with new ones, and he predicted that eventually the whole world was going to go to a communist system. Now, of course, we saw how well that worked out when it was applied in the Soviet Union. Now, what you also see, though, is that people like Karl Marx thought that God was the opiate of the people. In other words, God made people numb to the pain of life. And religion was like opium, just keeping you numb. So they said that faith alienates people from the economic realities, and it damages rationality. Now, that idea that faith damages reason was very, very big among the philosophers behind the French Revolution. They did not promote communism, but they did promote reason as supreme over faith and the state as supreme over the individual. They had the ideals. Remember, they promoted fraternity, well, first of all, liberty, fraternity, and equality. However, as we know, in that one section of France who said, you are taking away our liberty, that is, our freedom of religion, because you put reason against faith. And in fact, at one point, remember this, that the French revolutionaries, a couple years after they overthrew the king, dressed up a prostitute, put her on the main altar of Notre Dame. They renamed Notre Dame a temple of reason, and they dressed up this prostitute and called her reason, and had riotous kind of celebrations after this. Well, then they also stopped people of religion. They got rid of the priests who were faithful to the church. They made all priests sign an oath against their faith and their commitment to the church. And the people of the Vendée said, no, we are Catholic. We want our Catholic faith. So how did they respond? The state attacked them and eventually killed 600,000 of their own citizens in the region known as the Vendée. A place, by the way, that had been evangelized in part by St. Louis de Montfort. And they stayed faithful to their Catholic faith. And They were slaughtering men, women, and children. The scenes that the French Republican government described as taking babies on bayonets and tossing, trying to catch them on bayonets. This was, and the killing of men, women, and children, elderly, everybody, just slaughtering everybody, was what they did in the name of reason. Not at all unlike what nationalists would do later on. For instance, German nationalists under Otto von Bismarck would use that philosophy by which the state is more important than the church and reason more important than faith, and therefore that he had a cultural struggle, what they called in German Kulturkampf, against the Catholic Church. Of course, the atheists of the Marxists killed 61.9 million of their own citizens. The atheists of China, 75 million, and so on. So that these also became very immoral. And ironically, when they considered faith alienating, it was their rejection of faith and the promotion of reason alone that became the damaging, murderous, and genocidal practice. So that the Vendée was the first genocide of rationalistic people. It is not the last, and unless we come back to faith, they will continue. Now, these folks did not hesitate to present themselves as new religions, as in the case of the French Revolution. That's why they used Notre Dame to make reason into a goddess. And they created a new calendar. They got rid of the days of the week. They made a new week, I think 10 days a week or something, and they got rid of Sunday. All the different months were changed. All holy days and holidays were suppressed because having a new religion was the basis of their project. And when Lenin and Stalin died, they were put into tombs, so they would become like the tomb of Lenin became the center of Marxist religion. Again, a murderous religion at that. Oh, by the way, well, say, wait a minute, what about you Christians? Again, don't forget that in 2,000 years of Christianity, there were terrible crimes and murderous events, but it was 2.5 million over 2,000 years, as opposed to 305 million just in the 20th century alone. Now, they also wanted to change politics and the social plane. And this gave rise to these totalitarian systems like the French Republic or Otto von Bismarck's First Reich. Later on, the Third Reich in Germany under Hitler, the communist empire of Soviet Union and of China, the communist regime of Pol Pot. These horrendous, or you go to Mozambique and the terrors done in the name of socialist government there. All of these totalitarian systems have been disastrous for humanity. And that atheism, when you study, is by far, religion cannot come close to the terror, the evils, the murderous, genocidal destruction of atheism. Don't ever let anybody fool you on that. And again, go to hawaii.edu/powerkills to get more information about these things specifically. Now, then he goes on to science, scientific research. A positivistic mentality took hold, in which, again, like going back to William of Ockham, only the mathematically provable is acceptable. Only what you can show in terms of this cause and this event. They reject Hume, of course. And they abandoned the Christian vision of the world and rejected every appeal to metaphysics. That is, what is the purpose of life? you study these various elements in physics, biology, and all the other sciences. And these are wonderful to study astronomy and so on. But why do they exist? And questions, people who have the modern scientific view of positivism, that no, I only can say this happened and this happened. I can do these measurements. That's it. I cannot talk about purpose, because purpose then implies studying that somebody gave them a purpose. See, that's why scientists don't like to talk about purpose, because they say, well, then who gave it the purpose? Then, of course, you start moving toward the existence of God, and they don't like that. Also, many scientists, not all by any means, but many scientists reject a moral vision. They say, look, I'm just studying science, and all I'm trying to do is figure these things out. So what if it causes environmental damage? This is just about business and science. So what if it fixes environmental damage at the expense of the lives of other people? I'm just doing science. And they go back and forth. But it's, they don't always like to deal with the morals, especially when it comes to issues about origin of life and protection of life. Moral visions oftentimes are gone. Now, the extreme of that were the Nazi scientists who used prisoners in the concentration camps for horrendous pseudo-scientific, those were not real science. They were based on views that they got from bad science. But you still have others who have used a lack of moral vision to go forward on issues like in vitro fertilization and a wide variety of other issues. Or, as we now see, organ transplants and such sometimes are now being done very immorally, in the sense, not that it's wrong to transfer organs from one person to another, but you must have their full consent, and it must not kill that person. Now there is an industry, and this is more the problem of industry than science really, but it's one that says we can execute people, or we can murder a guy who seems useless to us anyway, and harvest his organs for the sake of other issues. And that's been going on in the abortion industry, especially in Red China. It follows that certain scientists, particularly those who lack any ethical point of reference, are in danger of putting at the center of their concerns something other than the human person. They don't see the integrity of the human person as the main point of their science. They don't see the entirety of human life as the point of science. Further still, they sense the opportunity of technological progress and seem to succumb not only to market-based logic, but the temptation of quasi-divine power over nature and even over human beings. Again, as in the case of, because it has to be some doctors who cooperate in organ harvesting from murdered people. Doctors are involved in that to make sure that they get the organs harvested properly and then transferred to the person that they believe needs it. And that's technological. That's where science, among some people, goes very much awry and turns to wickedness in the extreme form. That's not the only form by any means, but it is an extreme. Also, some of the people studying population growth, etc., have sometimes a far less than ethical values. For instance, somebody like Peter Singer over at Yale University places, and it's written, that the life of a cockroach is as valuable as the life of a human being. And he wants the human race reduced to 50,000 people. There are many folks who also want 50 million people, reduced from the present 7 billion to 50 million. So none of them volunteer. Now, one of the results of the crisis of rationalism, where you have only reason, is the appearance finally of nihilism. Nihil is a Latin word meaning nothing. So nihilism is a word meaning nothingism. That doesn't sound so good to use the Germanic word nothingism, so we just used the word nihilism. It's a philosophy of nothingness. You see this in a variety of forms. Jean-Paul Sartre, French philosopher during and after the Second World War, wrote L'être et néant, being and nothingness. You can get that in English. And he sees some of this point here, but there are others as well. Nietzsche is another one. There's a famous cartoon. Nietzsche had written, "God is dead." And somebody had written on a subway wall in New York, "God is dead," signed Nietzsche. Then below it, somebody else wrote, "No, Nietzsche is dead," signed God. But at any rate, what we see is that this nihilism, this philosophy of nothingness, claims that the search for reason and meaning is an end in itself. You don't have any hope of finding meaning. There's no possibility of ever attaining the goal of truth. You can't ever get there, but just the fact that you try, just make an effort, that's enough. And in the nihilist interpretation, life is only an occasion for sensations and experiences. So you experience certain fun things, and that's all you've got. There's no meaning to it. So that if you are rich enough, the world is your amusement park. And you just go from one peak experience to another. But there's no meaning to it. Think about that approach. When you hear about people promoting sexual promiscuity, promoting the eating of high-level cuisine, and getting foods that are extremely rare. You know, I saw in part of a movie, I didn't see the whole movie, but this guy was, wanted to drink a coffee made from coffee beans that had been digested by certain monkeys and passed out in their stool and then recollected and then roasted and given. I said, I have no idea why the product extracted from monkey stools would be such a high point of life. But I've never tried it. But this is what you see in nihilism. That life is a search through stools, and some of them would use vulgar terms for that. And only the ephemeral, things that come and go, have pride of place. Nihilism is at the root of a widespread mentality that claims that a definitive commitment can't be made. You don't have a commitment to marriage. You just go from one partner to another and add them all up. And if you can have hundreds of partners, this is fine, because commitment means nothing to the nihilist. And it should no longer be made. Don't make commitments, because everything comes and goes. It's all fleeting. It's all nothingness. And think about this. Whenever you are going through the food line, you're at the counter to pay for your food at the grocery store or the drugstore, and you see these magazines about Hollywood stars and stuff. They are living out a life of nothingness. And I guarantee you that so many of them simply promote a philosophy of nothingness in their movies because they believe that nothingness is all there is, and so therefore you should pay $10, $12 or whatever it is to go to the movie, so that you can imbibe a philosophy of nothingness and just the search for one experience after another with no meaning to it. That's what they have to offer. That's all that they've got to offer. That is not what we are talking about. We offer Christ, who is infinity, not nothingness. All right, we're going to take a break. We'll come back in a couple minutes and start dealing with some of your questions. So please stay with us. Thank you very much and welcome. Of course, we would love to invite you to come and join us. If you are able to get down here to Birmingham, Alabama, please contact our pilgrimage department either by calling them at 205-271-2966, or you can go to www.EWTN.com. And it will give you all kinds of information about scheduling of masses and programs that you can be part of, tours of the studios, directions up to Hansville to go pray with the sisters, and all sorts of things. So, plus they'll give you information about places you can stay. There's hotels and other facilities available here, places to eat. You get a chance to try some of my fried green tomatoes. It's not Lent yet, and so you know, get down there and go get some good barbecue or hamburger heaven and all that. So you know, come on down and join us. Love to have you. All right, let's start off with an email. First question, dear Father Pacwa, is there a difference between truth and objective reality? And can we say there is absolute truth? How do I speak to the atheist who tells me that truth is relative and that there is no absolute truth? I lose the debate when the atheist attempts to discuss the leap of faith using these concepts while citing Nietzsche and others. In my opinion, the atheist uses circular reasoning. And this is from Patricia in Maryland. Well, let me start off with your atheist friend. Your atheist friend uses illogical reasoning. I'm glad that, you know, actually I had this, I wanted to save it for when we're dealing with the topic we had today. What is the illogic of this, the inherent illogic? One is that he states, I think it's a, I don't know if it's a he, but he says, the atheist says there is no absolute truth. Remember, Patricia, to say there is no absolute truth is an absolute statement. So that this is inherently illogical. Spock would go crazy on Star Trek with such an illogical statement. I hope he would anyway. Because you cannot state there, you know, absolutely, there is no absolute truth. That becomes an absolute truth. And so you're making a statement about what doesn't exist while making it exist. You see the illogic? That is key. A second stage of illogic. Typically, if there is, you know, in dealing with this point of view, they assume that since there is no God, there is no purpose. See, that's one of the keys that we talked about earlier. That everything is the study of positivistic events. In other words, if I move my cup, if I lift my cup, these are concrete events, and I can analyze those events scientifically. Not worth evaluating that event, but they would say, look, I see this kind of spectrum of light coming from certain stars in the galaxies far away and so on, and I can evaluate it as specific events, but I can't say that there is a purpose to it. That is typical. Now, let's take it another step. They then, when you push them, they will have to admit that since there's no purpose, and there's no goal to existence, all of existence happens by accident. That's key for them. All of existence happens by accident. It's just an accidental event that planet Earth took the shape it did so that water could be formed here. And then, as the famous atheist Richard Dawkins said in a movie in which he was interviewed by Ben Stein, he said, well, I cannot explain the origin of life just on the basis of what we know of chemistry and physics on the earth. But God didn't create it. So what he says instead is that people from outer space dropped off some garbage. You know, they deposited it here, and the various microbes from that developed into single cells, etc. And then evolution just happened. It was an accident that they happened to use the Earth as a garbage dump. Why they wouldn't have used another planet for a garbage dump makes no sense to me, because there's not much else going on there. But, you know, and I don't know how serious Dawkins is about that, but he did state that as a more plausible explanation for the origin of life than believing in God. Still didn't explain where life started for the aliens, but be that as it may. They would still see everything as an accident in the evolution of the world. And all of it happens by accident, nothing of purpose. Now, this is something, Patricia, that is always key for dealing with atheists. As I already did for your friend by saying, your claim that there is no absolute truth is an absolute statement. You do believe in absolute truth, namely your denial of absolute truth. Similarly, I'm going to apply their argument to them. Now, atheists never, ever like it when you apply their own ideas and their own reasoning to them. In this case, if everything is an accident, it's just an accident. You were born a Catholic, and your parents trained you in the faith, and that you accepted the faith. It's just an accident of history. But if that's true, then it is just an accident of history that your friend is an atheist. No, I've thought it out. No, you are conditioned by your environment and the various accidents of history that happened around you to believe that you thought it out. But the belief that you thought it out is itself an accident of history. And no, I really did think that. I mean, here's the logic. No, you are conditioned by your environment to object to me telling you that you were conditioned by your environment. And it's just your parental conditioning or whatever other factors of your environment. And maybe we can subject you to positivistic studies of the various influences that made you an atheist. Now, they do not like that, but that is just as viable an analysis of atheism as is their analysis that we are Christians by an act of our faith. You know, they'll say, oh, it's just your environment. Well, that argument applies to them and makes their belief in reason alone and rationalism or idealism or any other idea they hold like nihilism, all of that is just as irrationally explainable as an accident of history as they use to explain our faith, the existence of the world, life, or anything else. So always think about their arguments and then turn it on them and apply the argument to their ideas and see how they run, just like the three blind mice. Now, let's take a look at, oh, by the way, I almost forgot. Patricia, you can get some insight into these Nietzsche and some of these other characters. If you go to a religious catalog, I think they still have it. It's a book by Ben Weicker and another guy, begins with M, and it's called The Architects of the Culture of Death. Architects of the Culture of Death. Weicker and his colleague, I forget, they both were on my show some years ago. Wonderful analysis of the characters who came up with idealism, nihilism, and all the other various atheistic philosophies and bad science that the Pope is talking about, and problematic science. Or also Ben Weicker's book on Charles Darwin. Very, very fine book, not only on Darwin, but most importantly, of his effects on inventing groups, or is it not inventing, but his effects on the ideas of the Nazi Party, Planned Parenthood, and a variety of other groups that use their version of evolution as a basis for eliminating people they don't like. Take a look at Weicker's book on that. All right, here's another one. Dear Father Mitch, I watch you and I'm blessed with your wisdom here in County Kerry, Ireland. My question is as follows. Why is there not a feast for God the Father? Can we classify each Sunday as a feast day on a weekly basis as the Father rested from his great work, and we respect and uphold this in honor of him in accordance with the commandment to keep holy the Sabbath day? Mark. Well, Mark, a couple things here. First of all, it's not the Father alone who rests on the Sabbath. It is the Lord God. So, and it's very important to keep in mind when you're talking about Trinitarian theology that whenever the Blessed Trinity acts outside itself, all three persons act. So all three persons create. The Father speaks, Jesus, the Son of God, is the Word through whom everything came into being, and the Holy Spirit is portrayed as hovering over the creation. So, all three persons rest. And it's even important that when Christ died on Friday, his body remained in the tomb throughout the Sabbath of the Old Testament to rise on Sunday, making that the Sabbath of the New Testament. But here's the thing. God the Father sent the Father and Son on specific missions. The mission of the Son is celebrated throughout the year on feasts of his birth, his death, resurrection, and so on, all the other feasts. Well, the mission of the Spirit is celebrated on Pentecost in particular, while the Father sent them, so that we celebrate Holy Trinity Sunday, in which all three persons are celebrated. But we also see that the celebration of the Father is in every single Mass. Notice that the preface of the Mass is addressed to God the Father. All of the Eucharistic prayers are addressed to God the Father, and that the fatherhood of God is celebrated daily in these, and of course in the inclusion of the Our Father in every single Mass. So that's something that's very important. I remember one time I was fired from a Catholic women's college where I was celebrating Mass, because when I read John 17, which was the gospel of those some 3 Sundays in a row, or 2 Sundays, I said the word Father, and they said, we can't say the word Father here. Well, I said, I can't change that, you know. And so then they fired me and the next priest, and they shut down the college. 6 months later. Then we also have another email. Dear Father Mitch, I've tried to read the book Dark Night of the Soul. I had to force myself to read it because I did not understand it. I got the message, however, and it convicted me. I'm wondering how one saint can have such authority to speak like this, where another Catholic classic differs so very much as in the story of a soul, in its wording and depth of meaning. Is this due to the spiritual maturity of a soul? Is it about educated, uneducated individuals? I'm confused. Please explain this vast difference in saintly authors. Becky in Virginia Beach. Well, Becky, it is a variety of issues. Saints are individuals. As a matter of fact, I said this to a friend of mine the other day. One of the characteristics of sinners is that they all look alike. Sinners act like one another, whereas saints, in their holiness and greater union with Christ, become more distinctively who they are. It's the saints who are the great characters of history, while the sinners are pretty much the same old rigmarole. Now, in these cases, Saint Therese of Lisieux, who was only in her 20s, with not even a full high school education, wrote very simply and wonderfully about her experience. St. John of the Cross entered it into another kind of depth, having more years, more education, and a greater poetic sense. He used, as you can see in his writings, great sensitivity to poetry. And he writes under the influence of the Song of Songs and others. So that this is very much part of what he did. And every other saint who writes about the spiritual life does something, uses their gifts that the Holy Spirit highlights and brings into full prominence. And this is what we accept. That's not confusing. It's just God saying, ooh, I like all these different kinds of saints and different kinds of individuals. Let me take one more from Jim in Alexandria, Virginia. Dear Father Mitch, how does a person who cannot speak go to confession? Is a deaf mute allowed to confess by using sign language with a priest who also signs? Or a person who suffers a stroke and cannot speak? Is he or she allowed to write down his sins and have them read by a priest? Jim in Alexandria. One of the things that, of course, people who cannot speak may use sign language. And that I don't recommend writing the sins down. As a matter of fact, a lot of people who have strokes can't even write in some cases. So they can express it the best they can. The priest can trust in the sorrow for their sins and give them absolution. Even though they can't put it, God knows what's in their heart and what's in their mind. But if they can express it in number and kind, and the priest can understand it, then he can give that. And then, of course, he has to give a penance that fits the limitations that they have with their disabilities. So that's what we do. All right. Well, we've run out of time. May the Lord bless you and keep you, cause his face to shine upon you. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And again, we want to remind you that this network is brought to you by you. You make it possible with your generous donations. So we ask you, please keep us in between your gas bill, your electric bill, and your cable bill, and we'll be able to pay our bills too.